So what exactly is the Word of Faith movement? Interestingly enough, over the weekend, I actually talked to somebody who didn't know what it was and had never heard of it. I thought everybody knew what this was, and I also met somebody who actually fully believed this doctrine that I got into quite a discussion with. I was pretty floored to find out that there are people who really believe this and find no issue with it whatsoever. So I decided it would be important to make a series on how many issues there actually are with this doctrine, and today we're starting with what it actually is. And as far as defining what the Word of Faith movement actually is, it can be a little bit complex because it's not like a specific denomination where they have like a statement of faith and they're like, okay, this is exactly what we believe. It's just kind of like a movement. It's this thing that a lot of people are involved in. So we're going to describe it today, as best as we possibly can based on what they believe and all of that good stuff, what they do and exactly what it is, so you can get an understanding of what Word of Faith is. If you've never heard of it or if you haven't really been able to define it, these are kind of like the key beliefs and concepts that will define the Word of Faith. Now, of course, there is a spectrum. There's some people that just believe in the healing part, and they don't take the wealth part, or they just believe in the positive confession, or whatever. They take little bits and pieces, and there's more of like a minimal versus a maximal, but we're going to get into that on other videos as well. So this movement actually emerged in the mid-20th century, largely within Pentecostal and charismatic circles, was then, still is today. And its core teachings focus on the idea that believers can use faith-filled words to bring about like specific desired outcomes in their lives. So you might have heard of like decreeing and declaring and blab it and grab it and all those kind of things. So the prosperity gospel, they believe in physical healing and financial prosperity and personal success and all these things. They believe that this is a promise. So we're going to get a little deeper into exactly what that means. And the key figures associated with this, you might have already heard, or if you haven't, is Kenneth Hagin, who is called the father of the Word of Faith, and Kenneth Copeland. You've got Benny Hinn. Those kind of guys are what we're thinking of when we think of Word of Faith. So you may have heard of some of these guys and their scandals and, all the crazy stuff that they do. So let's talk about their core beliefs. One is positive confession. So it's the belief that words hold power to create or shape reality. If you just hear that off rip, like, you can already see why that's a problem because it almost sounds like magic to me, right? But according to Word of Faith teachers, believers can speak their desired outcomes into existence by speaking positively and in faith. Sounds like law of attraction to me, but let's go into a little more detail. They often cite verses like Proverbs 18:21. The tongue has the power of life and death to support this doctrine. Clearly, though, that is not what this verse means. That verse is actually referring to building people up or tearing people down with your words and how to speak to others, which, reading the passage, it talks about good fruit and bad fruit. Jesus says that the good man from his good treasure brings good things out. And he says that the evil man from his evil treasure brings evil things out. And then he says, but I tell you, on the day of judgment, people will have to give an account for every careless or useless word they speak. By your words, you will be justified and acquitted of your guilt of sin. By your words, you will be condemned or sentenced. Directly after this, the Pharisees asked Jesus for a miracle or a sign or a wonder, right? And Jesus tells them only an evil and adulterous generation craves and demands for a sign. I am not sure if that sounds too much like health and wealth to me, or if God owes us something, or if he owes us a sign or a wonder. Just saying. But yeah, this is part of the problem, taking verses out of context, not going back and reading other verses and reading the whole passage and things like this. You can't just pick and choose a couple words and be like, oh, yep, there you go. That's what the Bible says. So that's what it is. It's not literal all the time. We have to read things in context, So doesn't quite work out all the time. So another one of their core beliefs is health and wealth. So Word of Faith proponents will teach that God's will is for all believers to live free from sickness and poverty. Interestingly enough, though, if it's never God's will for us to be sick or suffer, what about the passage in Exodus where God tells Moses, "Who made man's mouth? Who made the deaf, the mute, the seeing, or the blind? Is it not I, the Lord?" That kind of sounds like God decides who is not sick, for how long, etc., etc. They teach, though, that sickness and lack are often seen as signs of insufficient faith or spiritual issues that can be overcome with enough faith and positive confession. Don't get me wrong. I am not somebody who doesn't believe in the gifts. I'm not somebody who doesn't believe in the miraculous or miracles or prophecy or any of those things. I've had prophetic dreams and visions. I've heard from the Lord. I've seen miracle healings. I've seen all those things. So it's not that I don't believe this stuff. It's not that I don't believe these things can happen. I just believe that it's in the will of God, and God's a little bit more sovereign than that. So I'm just saying, and I do believe that sometimes we are afflicted with sickness for various reasons, and it's a case-by-case basis of why that happens. That could be a whole nother video that I might do eventually. All the reasons why we might still be sick or why we might get sick. Some of it has nothing to do with us. A lot of it doesn't have anything to do with us, but sometimes it does. You know, if you drank alcohol all your life and you going into liver failure now, it's unfortunate, but you didn't take care of your body, but that's not always the case. You see other people who do that and they live to be 100, and it's really weird, and we don't understand why. So it's not always cut and dry. It's not always explainable like that. And to just say like, oh no, you didn't have enough faith, so that's why you're sick, is damaging, and it's insulting to people. It's just putting blame on them. So this teaching of sickness and lack being signs of insufficient faith or spiritual issues that can be overcome with enough faith and positive confessions is really dangerous, and it's nonsense to me. And interestingly enough, I actually never thought I would actually hear somebody say that to my face, but over the weekend I was told exactly that by the person that I conversated with this about. They told me that it was my fault that I don't have my healing. And I was completely floored that they had the nerve to insult me and say this to me. And at that point, I honestly didn't even want prayer from them at all, because it was so offensive. It was the first time in my life that I didn't want prayer from someone. And mind you, I am a Bible-believing Christian since I was a child, and I didn't want prayer from this guy. I didn't. I was like, no, like I'm good. Like I this guy didn't even know me. He said these things to me, and he didn't even know anything about what I have experienced with God, what I believed about signs and miracles and wonders and healing and all these things. This was my first time meeting this person, and for you to just say like, well, that's why you don't have your healing, was just super duper offensive. And I was just floored that somebody would actually say that to me. It made me think, maybe you can't see my sickness from the outside, but would you go up to someone in a wheelchair and say that? Would you tell them that to their face? Or what about a parent with their kid with cancer, lost all their hair, just is doing really badly? Would you go up and say that to a parent? Would you say that to their face? I don't think so. You know what I mean? It was just very prideful, and it was really messed up, and like I said, God forbid if I was an unbeliever, it would have turned me off to God completely. So yeah, it's just not cool. So my message to those who are going around telling people that they don't have their healing because they doubt, I can tell you firsthand that it's ruining your witness. And again, like I said, if I was an unbeliever, you would have turned me completely away from anything you were trying to say to me about God. But thank God I'm not. And thank God it doesn't ruin my faith. It doesn't ruin what I believe about God, because regardless of what this person said to me, that's just sinful man. That's just prideful man. That's just somebody who's deceived, and I hope they learn the truth. But God doesn't owe us anything. He really doesn't. He doesn't owe us health. He doesn't owe us wealth. He doesn't owe us any of this stuff. And it's based on his will alone. If you pray for something in his will, it'll be given to you. If it's not in his will, it won't. And that's it. And the reason why it might not be in God's will is complicated, and we don't always know. His ways are not our ways, right? And another thing to consider, because this person was telling me the same thing, that no, it's based on our faith, and God's just waiting for us to use that faith. He can't do anything without it, and it's not based on his will. It's never his will for anybody to be sick. But Jesus said, pray like this, Father, holy is your name, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So let me stop before I pull out more verses about why this doctrine is false. But if it's not based on God's will, really logically, then why is Jesus telling us to pray like this? That if it's based on our will, which would be the faith. So another core belief is that they believe faith is a force. They believe that faith is often described as a tangible force that believers can use to bring about specific results. So again, like for me, this is like, this comes from you, not from God, because who says that whatever you're wanting to happen is God's will? Who says that that's what's best? You don't know that. You really can't say whether that's, for the best or not. We don't know, because it's based on God's will. Maybe it's not God's will for that person to live for whatever reason, and sometimes we figure it out down the road, and other times we don't, and we just can't always question it. It's hard. It's a hard truth. It's something hard to accept, but everybody dies. When Adam ate the apple, he condemned the world to death. We all are born with death. We're all born to die. We're all born, we have sickness, and that's just, we're finite. We're not immortal, right? So this interpretation shifts faith from being like trust in God to a tool that one uses to create their desired results. For me, that's called magic. That's manipulating God for your own will to be. And that's not what the Bible teaches. Where is God's sovereignty in this, right? So Word of Faith also emphasizes that believers have a divine right to blessings based on their statutes as children of God. This doctrine often is called King's Kids, that teaches that believers are entitled to blessings in all areas of life. Again, entitled. Are we entitled to, blessings every day, all the time? I don't know about that. And that's not what happens in real life. That's not reality. So if that's true, then why were all the disciples murdered for their faith in a gruesome way? The Apostle Paul, did he not have the thorn in his flesh that God said, no, my grace is enough for you, and he didn't take it away? Poor old Job, he got sick and lost everything via the request of Satan, and God said, yeah, go ahead, but don't kill him. So if it's never God's will for us to suffer or to have anything or to have any kind of, sickness or, to be poor and stuff like that, it just doesn't line up with what has happened in the Bible. If that was the case, then all of God's believers would have been healthy and wealthy and everything, and that's just not how it went down. That's just not how it has gone down. In the rest of the world. That's kind of like American feel-good gospel to me. So we've started getting a little bit into the points of controversy and criticism, so let's go a little bit deeper into that. As you can already tell, or you might be aware of, the Word of Faith movement has faced significant criticism from traditional Christian circles, specifically Orthodox, Reformed, and Evangelical groups. And here are a few common areas of contention, which I kind of already mentioned, but we're going to go a little deeper into that. So a distorted view of faith. Traditional Christianity teaches that faith is trust in God's will and character, not a force believers can manipulate. Critics argue that word of faith redefines faith into a tool of self-empowerment rather than a deep trust in God's sovereign plan. I would have to fully agree with this statement. Their view on faith removes God's sovereignty and puts it back onto the person, which is to me 100% false. God does what he wants. We can pray for stuff, but if it's not in God's will, it's not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. Another problem with this is focus on materialism. Again, this is kind of like an American thing. Many Christians feel as though the word of faith teaching promotes materialism, emphasizing worldly wealth and success over spiritual growth and maturity. So this contradicts the Bible's teaching that the call for humanity, contentment, and seeking treasures in heaven rather than on earth. So there's nothing wrong with having wealth that you worked for. There's nothing wrong, it's not better to be rich versus being poor, that's not a thing. But it should not be our spiritual focus. Like my spiritual focus is getting, wealthy and that God owes me health and et cetera, and I should never have to suffer and I should just be good all the time. That's just not how it works. It's just not what happens. Another problem is questionable theology. So some word of faith teachings border on what critics call little gods doctrine or theology, where believers are encouraged to see themselves as possessing divine-like powers because they are made in God's image. That's really not what that means, y'all. Made in God's image doesn't mean that we were made as other little gods. So this teaching is seen as elevating believers' power and autonomy to an unbiblical degree. And you can definitely say that again. I mean, that's exactly what this is. This is saying, like, whatever I want, whatever I think, God's got to do it because I've got this like magical formula where I do this little incantation of decreeing and declaring, and I've got this, faith, and it's got this magical power that God's got to comply with. No, it doesn't work that way. It just doesn't. My pastor told a story about his special needs child that died recently. They prayed over her, they did everything, they had all the faith and all that good stuff that she was gonna make it, and she didn't. We had a family member that just passed away where they prayed for 7 hours over him to be miraculously healed, and they all believed that he was gonna bounce back, and he did not. He went to be with the Lord. And you know what? That's okay. That's okay, y'all. It's okay. It's okay. That's just how it goes. We're all gonna go be with him someday. This life on earth is like a blip compared to eternity. So we have to keep that in mind, and it's not that it doesn't hurt, and it's not that it's not painful. I lost a very close family member just a couple months ago, and that was really hard for me, but I accept it. It was just his time. It was just his time to go be with the Lord. And I'm going to see him again one day. So it's all right. It's not that it didn't hurt. It's not that it wasn't painful. It definitely was. But we have to accept this. We have to accept this. We do. So, another problem is the biblical, and orthodoxy of Christian perspective. So Orthodox and traditional Christians interpret scripture to show that blessings from God may include health and provision, but they're not promised to every believer as a right or a guarantee. I would have to 100% agree with this. It is not a right or a guarantee, and it's not how it plays out in the life of believers in reality. So sufferings and trials are seen as opportunities for growth and deeper reliance on God rather than signs of weak faith. And that is a correct way to interpret scripture. I just can tell you personally, when I had COVID, and I had COVID pneumonia, and I felt like I was dying, there was something that God, wanted to speak to me during that time that I refused to hear at any other time. And it was somebody that I needed to forgive. And honestly, when I was in that low time of just begging God not to take my life, even though I had zero control over it because there was no treatment for me at that time. But he spoke to me during that time, and he used that time to get me to a place of forgiveness and actual, sympathy for that person that I was refusing to forgive and let go of. So I believe that those things happen, and he wants to speak to us during those times that we're low, that there's nothing else going on around us, that maybe it's the only time that we will hear him. So, those are just a few things to think of when we are in those times where we're our lowest, where we can get closest to him. So another thing to consider is that Jesus and the apostles lived sacrificial, humble lives, often experiencing suffering, poverty, and persecution, which counters the idea that prosperity is a mark of faith. I mean, gosh, if Jesus didn't have all the faith in the world, who did, right? Jesus was not rich. Jesus suffered on the cross, one of the most horrific and horrible deaths. But if it was a mark of how much faith he had, or his faith, I think that wouldn't have been the case. Don't you think? He would have been rich. He would have been like a rich king and all that stuff. So that wasn't the case. So I'm not sure how faith could be, how that faith could be less than ours today. Instead, though, faith is actually about surrender and trust, even when life does not go our way or according to our desires. Faith is not just psychological certainty. It means to trust, to surrender, to have faith in God that he's going to do whatever needs to be done. And like I said, sometimes we believe and we have faith in something, things don't work out, things don't go our way, and then 10 years down the road, we can look back at those moments and be like, you know what? That wasn't the best for me. I can see now why God took that thing away from me, or why he guided me in this different direction, or why I had to go through that thing, or how he's using that thing now today in my life. Even through tragedy, we can still see a silver lining, Sometimes we can go through really, really horrible things that can feel like what good could ever come from this, right? But in the long run, even though it's not like we're saying, well, God just wants you to suffer and he just wants you to go through bad things. No, like, we live in a fallen world. We live in a place where people do bad things to us, and we live in a place where there's bad diseases and mutations in our cells and viruses and all these things that came out from sin. So I'm not saying it comes from God, but God allows certain things. God allows certain things in our life. God allows people to die. He allows really bad things to happen sometimes. But even through it all, he can still use those things later on. He can still use it as a testimony. He can still use it. I'm not saying that you went through this horrible thing and God just wanted you to go through it so you could have a testimony to others. No, I'm saying that when these horrible things do happen, because God doesn't force people to do or not to do things. Like, let's say somebody did something really bad to you. That was that person's choice. God doesn't control us and keep these things from happening, because people have free will and people do bad stuff, and that comes from their own sin. So technically, in that case, that's not saying that that comes from God. But knowing that, this really bad thing happened to you, or this really bad thing that you went through, or maybe an addiction or something like that, or a trauma of some kind, God can use it later on in your life to help somebody else, or to prevent it from happening to someone else, or to prevent it from happening for generations down the line. Let's say, you broke a chain of addictions, and now, all your kids and your grandkids and their kids and everybody, you broke that chain, you broke that line, you know what I'm saying? So, or some kind of trauma that happened to you, and you decided not to keep that thing going, or you decided to speak up and tell someone, and then you gave other people the courage to speak up about it, and now you've saved a lot of other people based on awareness. Not to say that it was a good thing that happened, because it wasn't. But again, these things happen based on other people's actions a lot of times. Even, let's say you have a sickness, you have a lung disease because your parents smoked or something like that, and now because you unfortunately you have to deal with this because of somebody else's actions. You're plagued with this lung disease, your whole life. You've got to deal with it. maybe God will miraculously heal you, maybe he won't. But now you'll make sure you don't do that, and you don't do that around your kids, and now you've protected your kids and their kids down the line from having these sickness and issues because of something that you stopped where you were at. So I'm just thinking of examples of good things that can come out of bad, even though they're not good things. But just some things to think about, to consider. I could go into more detail, but I don't want to get too personal. So all in all, the word of faith pretty much teaches that faith is spoken words that hold the power to control reality, influence health, wealth, and success. While it has inspired some to develop confidence in God's promises, but it has also drawn criticisms for promoting a version of Christianity that emphasizes self-centered goals, material prosperity, and a name it, claim it type approach. And Orthodox Christian perspectives highlight that faith is not controlling outcomes, but trusting God's will, and that the Christian life includes trials that ultimately deepen reliance on God rather than material blessings. Because remember, Jesus said, "Take up your cross and follow me." That doesn't sound like health and wealth to me all the time. So nothing wrong with it, nothing wrong with being healthy, nothing wrong with having wealth, but if it's all you're going after, if that's your main focus, you might want to re-examine your views. So I hope that was helpful in explaining the prosperity gospel, the word of faith movement, what the key teachings are. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this down the road. I'd like to make a little bit of a series on this, just because I feel like it's such a problem and it's so dangerous. And like I said, just meeting somebody this weekend I said, well, what you're saying sounds a little bit like the, word of faith, movement. And he says, what's wrong with that? What's wrong with word of faith? And I'm like, whoa, what's wrong? What's not wrong with it? I just was floored. I just couldn't, I'm like, there's people in our circles that really, really believe this thing. So it really needs to be addressed. And yeah, this is a problem. So I hope you guys learned a little bit more today. And if you stayed with me through the end of this video, I hope you subscribe, like the video, and look through my other videos for more teaching.